Awesome. So welcome everybody to our second of our career panel series. My name is Maggie Chen. I am a current junior at Harvard College studying developmental biology and history of science. And I am the Chief Development Officer here at JYI. And we're so excited to have a truly fantastic lineup of speakers here today. These are pioneers in their field, and we're just very excited to hear what they have to say and to speak with them for an hour this afternoon. So I'm going to hand it over to my co-host, Punit, to introduce himself and also to introduce the speakers, and then we can get started.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Maggie. So my name is Puneet Trivedi, and I'm a fourth-year undergraduate student at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. And I'm studying life sciences. So I suppose, excuse me if I butcher your names. I've tried my hardest to find pronunciations online and such, but I may still butcher it. So we have, of course, the cream of the crop here, as Maggie pointed out. I'll start with Dr. Carl Wieman, who's a professor of physics at Stanford University and recipient of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2001. And then we have Dr. Emily Balskus, professor of chemistry and chemical biology at Harvard and recipient of the Alan T. Waterman Award from the National Science Foundation. And finally, we have Dr. Chien, professor of bioengineering at the University of California, San Diego, and recipient of the National Medal of Science for Engineering. And so, as you can all probably tell, those are some big awards. And so we have a fantastic conference here today. Very lucky. Thank you for coming.
Awesome. Alrighty, let's get right to the questions. So to start off, this is for all of the panelists, and I know that all of us here would love to hear the answer to this question. Could you please give a brief summary about your research work? And interesting stories, anecdotes about what you do in the lab are always welcome. So we can maybe get started with Dr. Wieman, since he's first on my screen.
So I spent the first 10 years of my career blasting atoms with lasers and seeing how they behave and manipulating them and studying their properties. And then I spent 20 years combining that, so having two research groups, one continuing to blast atoms with lasers, and the other group actually studying, doing research on what makes up expert physicists, how do they think, and most importantly, how do we improve the teaching of physics to have people learn to think more like experts. And then finally, my last 10 years, I've been just focusing entirely on this latter category, but really expanding beyond physics to thinking about expertise in science and engineering, what it's really made up of, how we can help more students with different backgrounds develop that expertise in particularly in their undergraduate and graduate careers.
Wow, that's really interesting, tying together both the research and also the education part. Awesome. How about Dr. Balskus?
Hi, everybody. So I study the chemistry of microorganisms. So my lab works at the interface of chemistry and biology. I kind of got to that research area in a maybe kind of unexpected way. I was trained as a graduate student in synthetic organic chemistry. So I was really excited about making molecules in the lab. But then I got really curious about how nature made molecules. And so did postdoctoral training in biochemistry and enzymology, studying nature's machinery for building molecules. And at that point, I started to realize that microbes are really nature's most talented chemists. And so I got really excited about exploring the chemistry of microbes in a number of contexts, including what is a major focus of my lab, the human microbiome. So the communities of microbes that live with humans. So I do research in that area and also teach various courses at the interface of chemistry and biology at Harvard.
Wonderful. I think that leads nicely into Dr. Chen, who also is a cross-disciplinary scientist.
Thank you. Maggie. I was born in China and went to college, pre-medical study in Peking University, and then finished my medical degree in Taiwan. I pursued my graduate study in physiology at Columbia University. I was doing work on the compensatory mechanisms of the body to hemorrhage. So it was cardiovascular physiology. But I was interested in math. And I found in physiology there was not that much math in the teaching and research. So I took many engineering courses, both at Columbia and at the City College nearby. And that formed the basis of my eventually becoming a bioengineer, in addition to being a physiologist. In 1988, I moved to UC San Diego from Columbia to join the Department of Bioengineering here. And I've been here since. I just retired. And now I'm recalled back to active duty, sort of part-time work, working on the role of the endothelial cells lining the blood vessels in controlling the normal and pathological responses of blood vessels to flow forces, shear stress, in terms of molecular, cellular, and genomic basis of the control and regulation in health and disease, such as atherosclerosis. So that's what I'm doing. And I'm very interested in teaching, both when I was in physiology at Columbia and now at UCSD in bioengineering. And I try to bring these together, let the students learn both ways, the biology and medicine on the one hand, and engineering on the other, try to bring these together. And for all of these, I feel the foundation of these three disciplines, biology, medicine, and engineering, all based on three basic scientific disciplines, namely physics, chemistry, and mathematics. If one is good at these three, you can do anything. If you're not, you cannot go very far in any discipline. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful answer. So I think the next series of questions, we'd love to dig a little bit deeper into each of you and each of your professional careers. So we can get started with Dr. Wieman. I think we're all curious because physics is something that is such a fundamental science. And there's also been a lot of really exciting physics research recently. So what do you think are the sort of emerging frontiers of physics research? What do you think are the places where the most incredible and exciting discoveries will come from moving forward?
So I'm going to give a strange answer to this question, but I can still remember back to when I was a young physicist, late in my graduate career, postdoc, and hearing all of these old physicists, they were at that time all old white guys, and being asked these kinds of questions about what was the future. And they'd all give answers which were basically some form of, well, extending the kind of research I do is going to be the important future of physics. And they were always wrong. And, when looking back on it, you can understand why they were always completely wrong, because when you've been working in an area of science for a long time, you get focused in on that area and you don't really keep as firmly up to date of all these new developing things. And so, I recognized at that time, boy, I really don't want to answer, when I get to be an old guy like I am now, have the sense not to be giving answers like I remember these that were always so wrong. So I'm going to tell you, and listeners to this, is that I'm not going to tell you where the important areas of physics are, and anybody who does, who's over the age of 30, you probably shouldn't listen to them because they're going to be wrong too. Okay. Now, having said all that, I'm going to spend just a little bit saying how I actually went through my career quite successfully choosing what was going to be a future area of physics at the time. And I used a process much more sort of systematically for making choices on this than I think most people do. And it was kind of looking back at history, seeing who'd been successful and why and when, and deciding it was very much following technology, that the important advances in physics weren't usually coming from some underlying great intellectual principle. They were coming because people developed new technologies that allowed people to manipulate and study matter in new and different ways, and that and then led to new scientific advances. I think it's probably true beyond physics, but probably not so much. I mean, there's clearly areas in biology and so on where you really want to figure out this area, whereas in physics, it really was kind of chasing the technology, and that's, that was successful in my career, and I think it's generally true, but it's not a kind of principle of choosing an area of science. It's choosing where things are going to happen in new ways.
Yeah, I feel like that's a great insight, is having the foresight to see, what might be an exciting area in the near future, and looking at technology is obviously a great way to do that. So I'll kind of pose a similar question to Dr. Balskus. So you mentioned that you do a lot of work in the microbiome, and specifically the human microbiome. So what made you decide to kind of specialize in that area, and how do you think that your work can be used, in a human context later on?
Yeah, so I got interested in the human microbiome right when I was kind of finishing up my postdoctoral research, and right as I was starting my own independent research program. And the microbiome is something that scientists have been interested in for a really long time. I mean, at the very birth of microbiology, when von Leeuwenhoek was looking through his microscope, some of the first microbes he observed were microbes from dental plaque. But until the last 10 to 20 years, it was really hard to study the human microbiome, in part because we didn't have a good sense of which microbes were there. Many organisms in the human microbiome can't be cultivated. And so advances in DNA sequencing during that period gave scientists really their first glimpse of the species present in and on the human body, and the diversity, the variation in communities between people. And so at the time I first kind of found out about the microbiome, we were in kind of that sequencing phase of studying the human microbiome. So a lot of efforts went into describing these communities and just sort of cataloging the species that were present. And I think that as a chemist, I thought about those efforts and realized that because these organisms were so poorly studied, most likely we didn't have a great understanding of how they actually did chemistry. So which types of molecules they were making, how those molecules were actually being made, specifically the genes and enzymes within the organism that were responsible for different activities. And I thought that was a really interesting knowledge gap. And one that my previous training really gave me the ability to try to fill. And so I think, this was a lot of I think, scientific success is often due to sort of being curious about things at the right time, and kind of having the right expertise to see these types of opportunities. So we started really becoming interested in linking gut microbial genes to enzymes and molecules. Now this is actually a pretty big area of investigation within the microbiome field. It wasn't when I started, but now there's a lot of interest in trying to understand what the genes in the microbiome are doing, not just kind of sequencing them. And so what I hope our research will lead to in the future, and I think this is a goal shared by the human microbiome field as a whole, is really we'd like to gain a mechanistic understanding of how differences in the microbiome impact human health and disease. So this is a big kind of open question at the moment, the extent to which differences between individuals' microbiomes really end up affecting human health. And if we actually discover that particular types of chemistry, particular metabolic activities promote disease, for example, then that opens up new opportunities for therapeutic development that just we have not yet recognized, that we never before had realized might be options. For example, targeting the microbiome with drugs, which is something that my lab is very interested in.
Wow, that's so interesting. It's also interesting to hear that it kind of all started from the sequencing boom, that this new technology was kind of creating this new field that you then were able to explore. So that's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll move on to Dr. Chen and your work in the field of fluid engineering and sort of red blood cells. I'd love to hear more about how interdisciplinary research that you had sort of influenced the way that you found these discoveries. And also, if you would tell us a little bit more about your work in fluid dynamics and in red blood cell shape.
Well, thank you very much, Maggie. First, I'd like to say that I really enjoy hearing what Dr. Wiseman and Dr. Balskus had just said. Their messages are very inspiring. Well, I started my work, as I mentioned, at Columbia University. And at that time, my work was more physiology. But over time, first I went into blood cell rheology, which is the flow properties of the red blood cells in terms of deformation and aggregation. And for that, I learned from my colleagues in engineering. I was very fortunate to have excellent collaboration with my engineering colleague. So I was able to make interdisciplinary inquiries into the mechanisms by which the blood flow is regulated. And this led me to eventually the study of the endothelial cells lining the blood vessels in terms of their responses to mechanical forces of flow. So this is so-called mechanobiology or biomechanics. And as I doing this, I gradually realized it's not enough to look at the organ system or even cellular level. We have to get down to molecular level and eventually genetic, epigenetic basis of this mechanism. So this is very interesting that we get down to very fundamental level and then build it up to the whole cell, the whole organ, tissue, and blood flow in the circulatory system. So it's an integrative approach going from molecular genetics to cellular tissue and organ level and the whole body and back and forth. So this allows us to understand the diseases that cause circulatory disorders, including cardiac problems such as heart attack or stroke, all of these problems. So it's interesting that the basic research has a clinical implication. So I'm very interested in doing these studies, and I appreciate the opportunity to do this kind of interdisciplinary research by collaborating with a lot of wonderful colleagues. And also I have many very talented students and postdoctoral fellows that were able to do these outstanding studies. So it's really a teamwork. I think it's extremely important that we emphasize the importance of teamwork.
Yes, for sure. It seems like collaboration is such a huge theme in research, particularly. And sort of moving on that, I think we are all curious as to your own experiences with scientific collaboration. So you've mentioned a little bit of your students, your postdocs, grad students, undergrads perhaps, and also collaborating with maybe external groups, other research groups. Could you talk about some collaborations that really kind of shaped the way that you do research and how those impacted your work? Maybe we can get started with Dr. Balskus.
Okay. So I have a kind of fun collaboration story, because actually the reason why I ended up switching from organic chemistry to biological chemistry actually kind of had its root in a collaboration. And actually, it was a collaboration that I actually started as a graduate student. So maybe this will be encouragement for students to be thinking about coming up with your own ideas for collaborations. I think it's never too early to kind of think about how you can work with others to make discoveries. So as a graduate student, I was working on making in the lab. I was working on making a natural product, so a molecule that actually was made by a microbe, but I wanted as a chemist to make it in lab. And it was a molecule that had a really kind of important biological function. So it was an inhibitor of an important human enzyme. And so the molecule had been studied for its biological activity. As a chemist, I was mostly focused on making this molecule in an efficient way. But what I kind of realized as I was completing my research and also starting to read a little bit about the activity of this molecule and the interaction it had with its enzyme target, I realized that my synthetic route would allow me to access a couple of analogs of my molecule that no one else had been able to access before, because they had always used different ways to make the molecule. And so I got really excited about the idea of testing these analogs to see if they were also inhibitors of this important enzyme. The enzyme is called the proteasome, and it's kind of like the garbage compactor of the human cell, and responsible for degrading misfolded proteins and many cellular proteins. And so I got really excited about this. I didn't know how to do it. I asked my advisor what to do. He recommended trying to reach out to somebody who was an expert in that enzyme. I luckily was able to find a professor at Harvard Medical School who had actually discovered the enzyme and studied it for his whole career. And I was thinking maybe I'll send him these molecules. But what he actually did when I came to talk to him about the project was invite me to come to his lab myself and learn how to run the assays and test the compounds I'd made myself. And that was just an amazing experience, because I got to see what research was like in a more biological lab. Really kind of highlighted the power of biological chemistry and the ability of small molecules to influence the function of cells, and just made me very excited to learn more about that field, ultimately actually kind of getting me into biological chemistry.
Wow. So it also kind of shaped your career pathway and
Definitely. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. I'll pass it on to Dr. Wieman.
So, I mean, I've had a number of really important collaborations throughout my career. And I have to say that, as I've matured and developed as a scientist, I think I've probably learned more, certainly made more critical mistakes and beneficial choices in the people that I've arranged to work with and how those collaborations have worked. And, a lot of people, have examples of going into some new field and working with different people, as you just heard. And for me, I have to admit, it's more kind of working with people who provide intellectual support, ideas, stimulation that I don't have in myself. So sort of adding to, I think, the intellectual power. I'll say a little more detail because I have a had a long collaboration and friendship with Eric Cornell, who won the Nobel Prize with me, and so on, where I think, I was reminded of this reading a story about a lot of science, some scientific history, and realizing how few collaborations actually sort of survive a Nobel Prize. And I mean, and I can understand why, sort of having been there, you have all this praise and people have egos, and it's very hard. And when you're working on a project, you kind of see the parts you're doing and more clearly and more obvious. And so they always naturally kind of seem more important than things other people you're collaborating with are doing. And so these things kind of always split up as people think want more credit. And Eric and I think, unlike so many other cases, we worked together for a long time, both before and after. We were very successful and made lots of other important scientific advances. But we did it not just because, I mean, it wasn't an accident. I think we both recognized during this whole period that, you're not just doing science with people, you're working with them. You've got to recognize the things that are important to them, and kind of you make trade-offs to make optimization so that you have to think about what's best for the collaboration and the other person as much as you do for your own self. And so, this is a kind of lesson in life, but it is very true in scientific collaborations where you have people, and at some level, we're all pretty competitive. We all have egos, and you just have to, recognize that and be thoughtful about how you're interacting with people in that process, how you're arranging the collaboration and the credit kind of early on so that you don't have misunderstandings and hard feelings along the way. Because, it is true. If you just sort of look at history of science, there's a lot more, there's many important collaborations, but very few of them kind of end well. And I think there's a lesson there to think about.
Yeah, always something to work on. I think
Yeah.
we often don't think of science as a people science, but it really is as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Dr. Chen, do you have anything to add to this topic of collaboration to wrap us up?
I have been very fortunate to have wonderful collaborators. I mentioned Richard Scalak back in Columbia. We collaborated. I think one of the key of collaboration is complementary expertise. So one can help the other and complement each other. Dick Scalak was a mechanical engineer. I was a biomedical person. So we're very complementary. So we're able to work together to model the deformation and aggregation of red blood cells in details using engineering mechanics together with biomedical research. So we're really complementary. Without him, I wouldn't be able to do that. And he also learned the biomedical knowledge from me. So we really help each other, and there was no conflict at all over more than 30 years of collaboration. We appreciate each other. We're really friends, and our families become very close as well. So it's not the competitiveness that sometimes you see in research community. It's quite on the contrary, is very, very uh, wonderful. And another one, a colleague I have is Shannon Weinbaum of City College, New York. He again is an engineer, and again we collaborate on our work on endothelial cells lining the blood vessels. It is also more than 30 years, and it's most wonderful. So I would like to say that collaboration depends on the complementarity between the two people or more than two people, and your personalities as well. I have the principle of 60-40. That means I will put in 60% of the effort. I will ask for only 40% of the credit. And this works always very well because 50-50 is hard to define. What is 50 for me may not be 50 for the other, but 60-40 always works. And over time, actually, I came from that because people realize I can work with them. They will be able to work with me without worrying about my trying to take advantage of them. So again, more support and collaboration. So that is what I'd like to share with you about my feeling about collaboration.
Wonderful. These are such important lessons, I think, for any student going into a research career to sort of take forward, because research is so much built on collaboration. So the next topic that I'd like to discuss is something that I think as an undergrad and as part of an undergrad research organization, we're all very interested in, which is science education, particularly as a college student. So we can start with Dr. Wieman, since you've done a lot of research on this topic. And I'd really just be very curious to know about, first of all, how this pandemic has really shifted our learning methods, and also what types of strategies do you think work in terms of communicating these really archaic scientific concepts, these difficult things to students who are just starting out in their careers?
So, I mean, yeah, this is an area that I've now been doing research in for 30 years. And I think the first and most fundamental idea of this is kind of goes that it and the conflict and sort of the new insights go to the way you described it as kind of conveying to students. The thing you have to recognize is that it's not a property of taking these brains and filling them up with knowledge, which is really the classic model and the underlying paradigm of thinking about learning. What we know now, and it's built around research on how the brain functions and so on, as well as research on actually doing experiments in teaching, like I do, where we take university students and we teach them in different ways and we do comparisons, just like in medical treatments of the outcomes. And the fundamental idea that you need to think about is it's a question of actually rewiring the brain. And so that happens only if the person is thinking intently, thinking about. And what we find ultimately is critical in learning science and learning to solve problems in science and engineering, which is what we really care about. It's think about what are the decisions involved in that process that a scientist makes, and having students actually practice those decisions. Now, of course, they can't do it at the high level, but you can think about what the sorts of decisions are, like looking at the system and deciding what are the important features of it, what are the important concepts that apply. Those are things that students can do at their level, practicing that same thinking, whether they're a first year college student or a graduate student. And so it's having that intense practice in making decisions and getting then guidance and feedback on making those decisions that's actually developing the brain, changing the wiring to have it have not just the knowledge, but really the capabilities of how to apply knowledge, which is what matters. So that's before we ever get to the issue of COVID and whether it's online or in person. And so I would say, in some sense, going online or not is a rather small perturbation compared to the change between thinking you're going to convey knowledge to people versus you're going to give them a setting and an activity and tasks and feedback that are practicing the thinking, the decisions you want them to learn. And, you can do that poorly or well in person, and you can do the same thing poorly or well when you're teaching online.
So it's more about the methodology of how you're teaching than like whether or not it's in person.
It's more, even more than that, it's more about the underlying principles of learning and what has to go into them. Now, implementing them in a educational setting, then we know a whole bunch more of principles and research about that goes into designing the activity, motivating people to do it, the learning that takes place from social interactions, the discussion, trying to teach others, trying to evaluate them, and so on. Those, there's a lot of details that are right, but fundamentally you have to start with the right principles about learning, but just having people practice making scientific decisions and getting feedback on those decisions.
Of course. Yeah. And I'd like to push it over to Dr. Balskus. So fun fact, Dr. Balskus was actually my biochemistry professor. It was an amazing class and did implement, I think, a lot of the things that Dr. Wieman was talking about. So, Dr. Balskus, I'd love to hear your take on undergrad education. What are sort of the tenets that you try to embody for classes, and also in the pandemic, because you were the one who had to switch everything over to virtual format, which went really well. I mean, I think that was a very seamless transition, at least on, from my perspective. So yeah, anything.
That's a great.
I just have to say, I'm not sure, in some sense, Maggie should tell us about Dr. Balskus' class. But go ahead, sir. I'm just joking.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful feedback, Maggie. Thank you so much. So I have not done any formal research in science education. One thing I will mention is that really, for me, I got into teaching science before I actually became interested in research. I got interested in science because I had amazing science teachers in high school and got involved in science outreach and volunteer work in sort of science education during that time. And that's really was kind of my path to research. So it was always a goal of mine, once I got excited about a research career, to also have a career where I could teach. So I really love being at an undergraduate institution that has undergraduates, so I can teach classes like Chem 27, which was the class that Maggie took. So at least for me, some of the things that I really think about when I'm designing classes or thinking about how to teach classes like biochemistry, particularly for a course like Chemistry 27, which is biochemistry, but kind of from an organic chemistry perspective. So we were studying the organic chemistry of enzymes and metabolism. One of the things that I really tried to do with that course was to really emphasize how the principles of what we were learning were applied in the real world. In the case in this course, how they were kind of applied in medicine and drug discovery. So we talked about how a knowledge of an enzyme's mechanism might help you to design inhibitors of that enzyme that could be important drugs. We talked about metabolism and the transformations involved in metabolism that could go awry in disease. And teaching an audience of students, many of whom are really interested in careers in medicine, it's my hope that material, seeing examples of how an understanding of organic chemistry is relevant to those fields, will engage students with the material and generate excitement. The other thing that I've tried to incorporate into my teaching when I can is opportunities for undergrads to engage in discovery-based research. So one of my favorite classes I've taught at Harvard is a research-based freshman seminar. So this seminar allowed a group of first-year students to get involved in research in I specifically try to target students who haven't had the opportunity to do research. And the idea is that by really getting students engaged in discovery-based research early on in their college careers, they get interested in doing research further. They start to identify as scientists and realize that this is kind of become familiar with some of those ways of thinking and principles that Carl was talking about, and then sort of approached perhaps their classroom science courses with that kind of context in mind. You sort of knowing that scientific research is sometimes is not just sort of accumulating knowledge, but is actually kind of problem solving and trial and error and kind of having a sense of what a career in science means. I think might help some students to kind of engage more in some of the more fundamental coursework. So yes, those are just some of my thoughts about teaching, and it's really one of the most fun parts, I think, of my job.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because it's really like the research part of your career is not all textbook regurgitation. So kind of implementing those skills and learning to practice them early is very helpful for us students, I think. So I think we'll go next to Dr. Chen. And the question here is, the UC San Diego bioengineering program kind of rapidly grew to be one of the best in the country. And so I'd really love to hear what key lessons you kept in mind in sort of supporting the next generation of students, whether it's undergrads or grads or postdocs, and growing the program and really making it what it is today as a leader of the department.
Thank you very much, Maggie. Yeah, I moved to UC San Diego in 1988. At that time, the bioengineering was a program within another department, applied mechanics, engineering, science. I felt that as a sub-program in a department, you cannot grow very much because recruitment would be very limited, faculty very limited, and the student training was not geared to our own discipline. So I decided to build a department, but it took many years. Among other things, we need to get the people together. We only had 6 people in the department, so I organized an institute to get many people on campus who are interested in bioengineering to get together to be a part of this institute. And also, the university funding was very tight at that time. So I applied for develop an award from a private foundation called the Whitaker Foundation. And because we had this institute, we had the people, we were able to get the leadership award, the development award from the Whitaker Foundation of $5 million. And that gave us the money to start a department. We did not need anything from the university. So you always have to help yourself, not always rely on others, even within the university. We try to do it ourselves, and then we formed the department. And once the department is formed, we were able to recruit faculty. And there we try to decide on the area and of the recruitment, and of course quality. Excellence is number one. And we started some new areas such as system biology, which was not in bioengineering. Actually, we were the first one in the country, and there are now many departments with emphasis on system biology. So, and also we were able to recruit our own students. We had a graduate studies office and design our curriculum. So everything feeds into everything else. So we gradually build up the department with time. And as Maggie said, now it's considered as one of the top programs. So we're very fortunate. It's really a teamwork. I think any of these activities, you need to have a team, not any one person, but a team of faculty, team of staff, team of students, and also collaborate with other departments, other programs on campus, and also with other programs beyond the UCSD. So this kind of team approach allows us to grow and develop. Now we have over 30 full-time faculty, starting from the 6 back in 1988. So this is really a very rewarding experience. You can see how efforts from many fronts, not only people, but program, funding, they all come together. Everything is necessary, nothing can be spared. The other thing I like to mention in relation to the students, I think both Dr. Wieman and Dr. Balskus have made outstanding presentations on these areas. I just like to add one thing, that in training our students, of course, emphasize the importance of being creative to generate important, innovative ideas, and to have a methodical approach to design and solve the problem. But beyond these, I emphasize also the presentation of the results, both in terms of manuscript writing and meeting presentation in PowerPoints and other things. I really pay attention to details. And I think excellence needs rigor. And we have to be careful about everything, the use of the words, the construction of the slides. And the people coming out of my lab, they really pay a lot of attention to these aspects. And also the final thing I like to say is I really treat the people in the lab as get to the work. I invite them to my home. My wife is very supportive, very helpful. She's wonderful. Then we have this kind of gathering periodically. And when the students and fellows leave, they become really a part of the extended family. Last year, when I retired from UCSD, they formed a symposium for that occasion. I was surprised that all of my PhD students and fellows, they came from near and far to attend this, and this is really most rewarding. I mean, teaching, what else can we ask for when we get such outstanding students, fellows, and they are so strong in their feeling attached to the department, to the program. This is really the best that you can ask for. It's most rewarding.
Yeah, and I can say from the student standpoint, we're obviously very grateful to have people like you all as teachers, just learning from the best of the best. So it's a very special experience. Alrighty, I will kind of switch to our Q&A portion. So I see that we have one question from the audience, and I'll also be checking questions on our conference platform on WOVA. But Puna, do you want to take that question? I think it's for Dr. Balskus.
Yeah. So okay, so the question is for Dr. Balskus. What are your thoughts on one, the gut microbiome being linked to innumerable non-infectious related diseases? He or she saw a paper about Alzheimer's specifically. And two, any thoughts about bacteriophages in the microbiome? They saw some findings in the virus-host interactions there. Thanks.
Yeah, so those are two really great and really big questions. So I would say the field doesn't really know a lot about how to answer those questions yet. These are two big problems in contemporary human microbiome research. In terms of disease connections, maybe one thing I'll just emphasize is that a huge open question is the issue of causality. So a lot of the connections between changes in the human microbiome and various diseases in humans come from sequencing microbiomes of patients versus healthy controls, and noticing that there are differences. Now, that could indicate that microbes, change in the microbiome is causing a change in human biology that influences or leads to disease. That could also mean that the diseased human is a different host for the microbes, and a different community thrives within a diseased host. So this is one of the biggest questions that microbiome research is trying to disentangle. I would say that we don't know for diseases like Alzheimer's whether or not the microbiome is playing a causal role. That being said, one thing to keep in mind is that we can kind of think about potential plausible hypotheses that we can begin to test. And one of the most exciting hypotheses that actually is building support is that many microbiome disease associations may involve changes in the immune system. So maybe taking Alzheimer's disease and other neurological disorders as an example, there's independently in other sort of areas of disease biology, people are linking changes in the immune system to diseases like this, and where we're learning that the microbiome signals to the immune system influences the development of different immune cells. So I think we're starting to piece together plausible mechanisms for causality in diseases, and now the challenge is to really test those hypotheses. So sort of stay tuned. I think the field will answer that question hopefully in the next stage of microbiome research. In terms of bacteriophage, so bacteriophage are viruses that infect and attack bacteria. Certainly, I think within the last few years, especially, the field has gotten very excited about the possibility that bacteriophage in the human body are shaping the composition of the human microbiome. We're starting to characterize more human-associated bacteriophage. This has actually been ongoing for a while, thinking about using bacteriophage as therapies. That's been raised and explored clinically in the context of infectious disease, and now others are starting to think about bacteriophage as tools to potentially reshape the human microbiome. But I would say, again, a really common theme in microbiome research is that we lack a mechanistic understanding of exactly how phage in the human gut, for example, might be actually shaping the community. You've again highlighted really exciting areas for contemporary research, and hopefully we will know more in the near future.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Balskus. Alrighty, I have two more questions, one each for Dr. Wieman and Dr. Chen, which is perfect. So we'll get started with Dr. Wieman first. The question is, a lot of college professors have a background more in research as opposed to teaching. So can that kind of hinder the teaching? And how do you think that lecturers and professors can better, become communicators to their students who may not have as much background as they do?
So we actually have a sort of, there's a term in cognitive psychology for this called expert blind spot. And that's the idea that as people become too expert in something, they forget about the things that they had trouble learning and that are difficult. And so they just kind of skip over those, and that really hinders their teaching. So the way I have come to think about this is that, again, we have sort of an underlying paradigm of thinking about at the university level, which is that if you're an expert in the subject, that makes you an expert in how to teach it. And I think the research is showing more and more clearly that that's just fundamentally incorrect, that there is real expertise in teaching. There is an expertise in medicine. There's a set of practices and principles that if you follow those, you know about them and follow them carefully, that that you'll result in students learning more than if you don't. And those are simply different from knowing the science, to, knowing the effective ways to teach it. And so right now, I think in general, college teaching is far less effective than it could be. And so if we had teachers that were not just expert scientists, but were also had some teaching expertise, which at least the level we're at now isn't nearly as hard, doesn't take nearly the time and effort it does to develop the expertise in science. But if that was developed, you'd have far more people, far more students learning science and learning it effectively and learning more science and better science. And that would be true. That's true for not just the students who will go on to be better scientists and engineers, but all the students going into so many occupations where now uh, just knowing basic science will let you be more successful in your occupation, will be more successful in your decisions about your own life, and in the decisions now that citizens are, public policy things about what should we do about healthcare, what should we do about energy sources and environment. All of these things, if you had a better understanding of science and that scientific way of thinking, you could be better at it. And then, frankly, until we start we as a society and we at universities start recognizing that you really have to have expertise in teaching to be really anywhere near as effective as you can be, we're not going to achieve that. But I think hopefully we'll be moving towards that in the not too distant. Well, we're moving towards it now, but moving towards it faster.
Yeah, and I think from an undergraduate perspective too, there's so many ways to get experience in teaching, becoming a TA or a course assistant or something. So definitely seems like there's a lot of opportunities out there to develop that skill that you're talking about teaching.
Yeah, but it's not just experience.
Yeah.
I mean, you have many, I can sadly point you to a vast number of Stanford faculty who are enormously prominent in their field, have enormous experience, and are terrible teachers. I mean,
Uh-huh. Yeah, of course. Well, always something to work for, I suppose, in the research community. Alrighty. My last question is towards Dr. Chen, coming from our conference platform, which is, how do you think that undergrads, or I guess just students in general, can become involved in research, like taking that first initial step into research and sort of becoming a leader? How can we best develop those leadership skills as students, starting from where we are now?
I just want to quickly break in here
Yeah.
and connect this up with what Emily said. I think it's, as a foreshadowing it to the answer, one of the things that's clear is it's enormously important for students to get that early experience, as Emily talked about, as really a shaping of how they think about all the other material they're going to be, encountering and learning, is thinking in that experience. So I'd say undergraduate research is enormously important for that reason. So I'll let Dr. Chen talk about how students can best do that.
So I will answer by using what we do at UCSD bioengineering as an example. We have a freshman course called Introduction to Bioengineering. That is the first course they come into contact with. And in that course, I will give an introduction of the whole department, what kind of research activities are there. And then this is followed by individual faculty members to present their research. So by the end of the course, the students really have a pretty good feeling of what's going on in the department. They can pick and choose the areas they're interested in and to contact the faculty to perform research in the lab, either in the summer or during the year. So this has been extremely fruitful. We have many students who have done this. There's an elective course of research in faculty labs. So this has really led to very successful experience for the students in doing research in faculty's lab, and sometimes they even stay on for several years until graduation, or some of them may even become a graduate student in the department later on. So this is what we have done here, and I think this is a very important aspect of our education, to provide the environment and possibility for the students to pursue research.
Perfect. And research is fun too as well. So I think what we're getting from this panel is really just start early and reach out to people, which is really exciting. And I think all scientists are a lot more receptive than we may initially think them to be. People are generally very encouraging. So that's great. Alrighty, we're at time, but I just really wanted to thank all of our amazing speakers again. We really, really appreciate you taking the time to come and speak with us and share your wisdom with us, especially in this virtual environment. And it was great to see everybody. And I just wanted to thank all the attendees also for dropping in. But all in all, we're very grateful to have people like you to look up to and as mentors. So thank you again for all of your work and for coming to speak with us today.